Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and this is part 2 of my summer project. I talked about the planning and inspiration for this project in part 1, which I will link in the description in case you missed it. But today I am jumping straight into making the dress, starting with the bodice. This dress has a princess seam bodice, so I just took my basic bodice pattern and followed a tutorial that I found online to convert it into princess seams. And since I wanted to make sure that this definitely fit, I did actually take the time to make a mock-up out of white cotton voile, which after I determined that it did in fact fit, I set aside to use as the bodice lining later on. With the pattern figured out, I started cutting out the pattern pieces. I first cut the pattern out of white broadcloth, which I then flatlined onto a square of purple voile. And this is because the voile was too thin to use by itself, so it needed something under it. And it actually gave it a pretty cool effect because you could see glimpses of the white underneath the purple, which just kind of made it look a little cooler, kind of almost like some linens that I had seen when I was originally looking for fabric for this dress. Once all of the pieces were cut out, I started assembling the bodice mostly how I normally would. So I attached the center front bodice to the side front pieces and the center back piece to the side back pieces. I then attached the front to the back at the shoulder seams before stay stitching and serging the neckline. And I also serged the side seams, but I did not sew these because I needed the bodice to lay flat for the next step, which was the neckline embroidery. And I'll talk more in depth about the embroidery in next week's video. After I finished the embroidery, I stitched one side seam all the way down and about 2 inches down on the other side seam, leaving the rest open for the zipper. Then I attached the bodice lining to the outer bodice at the neckline before clipping the curves and flipping the bodice's wrong sides together. Then I basted the raw edges together just to hold everything in place. Now for the sleeves, these are done in 2 pieces. So the upper sleeve is just a shortened version of my short sleeve pattern, and I cut 2 layers for each sleeve. So basically I cut out 4 sleeves, flatlined them together to make 2 sleeves, serged along the hem, and then folded it up and pressed it into place. And that was so I knew where the embroidery would go on that. In hindsight, I should have done 1 layer of white and 1 layer of purple like I did for the rest of the dress, because the 2 layers of purple is just darker than the rest of the dress and also lacks that kind of cool effect of having the white underneath. The bottom of the sleeve was a flowy waterfall sleeve, and for this I decided to do half circles out of white voile, which is the same fabric that I used for my mock-up / bodice lining. So to determine the length of these, I just placed the upper sleeve onto my shoulder about where it would sit once it was attached to the bodice, and then I just measured from the hem of the upper sleeve, when it was turned up that is, down to my wrist. So that was the length. Then for the width, I measured the hem of the upper sleeve and doubled it. I then inserted that number into a circle calculator as my circumference. Essentially what I'm doing here is following the same directions as making a half circle skirt. So then a lot of math later, and I cut out a large circle with a smaller circle in the middle. I then cut that circle into half, giving me 2 half circles, 1 for each sleeve. I serged the upper edge of these pieces and then finished the lower edge with a rolled hem. Then I used a French stitch to sew the underarm seams because since this was so much drape, it would have been very visible if I had finished it with like a serged edge like I normally would. Then for the upper sleeves, I did stitch the underarm seam on them just with a regular stitch and then serged it like I normally do. I then lined up those serged edges and stitched them together using not really a basting stitch, but a longer stitch than I normally would. This because later I plan on taking the white piece off and converting this dress into more of an everyday dress. So longer stitches means that's easier to do later. I then folded up the hem and hand stitched it in place, making sure only to catch the purple fabric and not the white fabric. And again, this just makes it easier for pulling it out later, as well as because doing it by hand meant that I wasn't going to catch any of the embroidery on the sleeve. And then I just attached the sleeves to the bodice with a basic straight stitch, followed by sewing around the edges. This was rather nerve-wracking because with such big sleeves there was always a chance that something's going to get caught in that seam as I was going, so I took it very slow and tried to really pin up as much of the sleeve as possible so that it was out of the way as I was going. Now the skirt is just 2 rectangles, so you wouldn't think that would be so difficult. However, I wanted a specific look and had decided to do inverted box pleats that lined up right underneath each of the seam lines or seams on the bodice, which meant that before I could cut anything out, I had to do some math. With the hard part out of the way, I started cutting out all of my pieces. I cut the front and back skirt pieces out of both the purple voile and the white broadcloth. Everything was going fine, I thought, and then this happened. So as I'm editing, I'm just going to jump in here and explain what happened because my original footage did not have good volume. So basically what happened there was I cut the skirt at the wrong length. So yes, despite all of my careful measuring and writing out all of my measurements, I still cut it wrong because I failed to actually look at the paper that had those measurements on it. So that was certainly unideal, but thankfully it was salvageable. I just had to do a much narrower hem than I had intended. And once I had all of that sorted out, I just cut out the pocket pieces and set about assembling the skirt. And this is pretty basic for most of my dresses. I attached the pocket bags to one side of the skirt front and back, stitched that side seam all the way down, and then attached the pocket to the other side with a slight allowance for adding the zipper. And if you watch any of my dressmaking videos a lot, you're probably tired of hearing about this, so I will just link the detailed tutorial in the description if you want to find out more. With one side seam sewn and the other one still open, it was time to attach the skirt to the bodice. So to do this, I started at one edge and pinned the skirt to the bodice flat all the way up to where the seam allowance started. I then made a small pleat. Then I moved on to the next seam on the bodice and did an inverted box pleat. Then I moved to the next seam and repeated those pleats. At this point, I then switched to the other edge and repeated that whole process. This way I was working from each edge in towards the middle, finishing at that one already sewn side seam. And this just let me make sure that there were no inconsistencies or mistakes in my measuring and cutting, and that any that were kind of hidden away on that one side. And I did attach the skirt to the bodice with a basting stitch first, just so I could see if everything was laying correctly and if I actually liked this design. And once I was sure of that, I just went back in with the permanent stitches. Then I serged any remaining raw edges, attached the zipper, and sewed up those side seams. And I should note that I actually left the skirt as 2 separate layers, so when I sewed that side seam, it was basically being sewn in independently, each layer independently, instead of together. And I hemmed it the same way, so each skirt's hem was done separately. Now for the hem, I did just roll up the serged edge twice and stitch that on the machine. And with that, the dress is mostly done. There is still some embellishments that need to be added, so I hope you will join me next week for part 3 when I talk about the embroidery.